I'm Tom, coming to you from the International Institute for the Advancement of Sourdough Science and Research of Cleveland, Ohio, also known as my kitchen. Thank you for selecting this video. Now, recently, some people have sent me some questions and comments asking if the Institute is actually a real place or if it's some kind of joke. So I just stepped outside to take a photo of the building. I had to get a special zoning variance to build that in a residential neighborhood, but there it is. Now, the purpose of today's video is to introduce a new method of baking sourdough, and the way to understand this is that I have to go back in history to tell a little bit of a story. So I started baking sourdough bread in November of 2019, and I launched this video channel, The Sourdough Journey, in February of 2020. Little did I know that 2 weeks later, we would be in a global lockdown with the coronavirus pandemic. People were locked in their homes. They weren't allowed to leave. In some countries, you could only leave once a week to buy groceries. In other countries, you didn't want to leave more than once a week because people were washing their groceries before they brought them inside. People were stuck in their homes. Many bakeries were shut down. There was a shortage of yeast, so people learned how to make sourdough bread during that time. There was an explosion of interest in that topic, partially out of necessity, but also partially because people had more time. If you also recall back then, employers either required or allowed their employees to work from home. Many people were out of work, so people had the time to pick up a hobby that takes 36 hours to make a loaf of bread that normally busy people wouldn't have had time to do. So there was this tremendous growth, probably millions or more people around the world baking sourdough bread for the first time. And there was an incredible outpouring of sharing during that time. People were sharing knowledge on social media, helping other people learn to bake. I helped thousands of people learn how to bake sourdough bread, and people were also sharing their bread. I mean, people got such enjoyment out of baking nutritious bread for their families, sharing it with their friends, their relatives, their coworkers on the rare occasion that they met in person. But then around May of 2021, 18 months ago, when the vaccines started to roll out globally, people had to go back to work, kids went back to school, and a tremendous number of those pandemic bakers, the people who learned to bake sourdough during the pandemic, they gave up sourdough baking because it takes up too much time. It's too complicated. So what I've been focused on for the last 18 months, literally, is doing experiments and tests and looking at different methods, trying to find a way to help the pandemic bakers, the people who learned to bake during the pandemic, get back into sourdough baking. That's what this video is all about. So what is this method all about? I'm going to teach you a simplified way to make sourdough bread that focuses on complete preparation of the dough in the evening, 25 minutes total elapsed time. No autolyse, no fermentolyse, no stretch and folds, no coil folds, no lamination. 25 minutes end to end. You have the dough prepared for an overnight bulk fermentation. The next morning, you spend either 5 to 35 minutes to shape the dough. 5 minutes if you want to skip pre-shaping, 35 minutes if you want to do pre-shaping, a bench rest, and final shaping. You put that dough into the refrigerator before you go to work, and then you can bake that bread anytime in the next 8 to 72 hours. That's the method. Here are examples of loaves I've made using this method. Now, I'm confident if you follow this method, you can make loaves that look just like this. And as you look at these, remember, 25 minutes of total preparation time. No autolyse, no fermentolyse, no stretch and folds, no coil folds, no lamination. These loaves look as good as some of the loaves I've made using the most complex recipes and methods. So what I'm doing with this technique is compressing hands-on time, waiting time, kitchen time, taking as much wasted time out of the process as possible, and then breaking it up into these 3 steps where you can control the timing: mixing, shaping, baking, to work that timing around your busy schedules. Now, there are a number of sourdough recipes and videos out there that claim you can make sourdough bread with 8 minutes of hands-on time or hands on the dough. Well, that's interesting, but who's measuring the flour? Who's washing the dishes? How much time are you spending standing around watching your dough rise, waiting 30 minutes to do a stretch and fold? I mean, the total amount of time that it takes isn't the hands-on time, It's the total kitchen time. It's the waiting time. So what I'm looking at is that entire process and trying to compress the time down. And the second thing that I focus on with this method is even though it's a multi-day process, your kitchen doesn't look like you're making sourdough bread for 2.5 days. Now I know when I first started making sourdough and told my wife I was going to bake, I would take over the kitchen for 2.5 days. I had bags of flour, I had jars of starter, I had stalagmites of starter growing in the sink. I mean, the place was a mess, and I occupied the kitchen until the whole process was done. So even though this method I'm proposing is a multi-day approach, you start with a clean kitchen, you complete the step for that day, you end with a completely clean kitchen, and you have all your tools prepared for the next day. So this is a completely different process where if somebody walked into your kitchen, they're not obviously going to say, "Oh, I see you're making sourdough." Your kitchen's going to be completely clean. So I'm always a little skeptical when people say they've invented a new sourdough method or recipe. People have been making sourdough for 4,500 years. I mean, how many different ways can you do it? So what I'm doing is basically borrowing methods and tools and techniques from 4 different bakers, and I'm putting those together in a unique way with a little bit of my own flavor added that creates this unique approach. The 4 bakers that are influencing this method: number 1, Chad Robertson. In my opinion, everything in sourdough starts with tartine. I'll use the basic tartine country loaf recipe, and then I'll do a very different way of mixing the dough and bulk fermenting the dough, but then the shaping, final proofing, and baking is textbook from Tartine. The second baker who influenced my approach is Richard Bertinet. He popularized the slap and fold method of mixing dough and developing gluten, not to be confused with the stretch and fold method that Chad Robertson uses in the Tartine bulk fermentation process. The third baker that's influenced this process is Elaine Boddy. She has a new book out called The Sourdough Whisperer, and Elaine has really popularized the overnight bulk fermentation at a cool temperature method. And then the fourth baker who's influenced this method is Frederick Winslow Taylor. Frederick Winslow Taylor, you say, I'm not familiar with that baker. He's actually not a baker. He wrote a book in 1909 called Scientific Management, and he's the father of industrial engineering, efficiency studies, time and motion analysis, total quality management, lean manufacturing, Kaizen, Six Sigma, all came from this concept of scientific management. So what I'm doing is uniquely applying these techniques to the sourdough baking process to eliminate waste, reduce labor, simplify the process, and improve the consistency of the outcome. I mix all these methods together to create this unique method called post-pandemic sourdough for busy people. So my goal with this approach is to create a way for the pandemic bakers, the people who learned to make sourdough bread during the pandemic, to get back into baking sourdough bread, a hobby that I know they loved so much, making delicious bread, sharing it with their family, friends, and relatives. So how should this work? On a weeknight, let's say you come home from work, you make dinner, you clean the kitchen, the family retires to the family room to watch television. I don't even know if people watch television anymore, but let's assume they do. And about 8 o'clock at night, you get up from the sofa and say, I'm going into the kitchen. And your family says, what are you going to do? And you say, I'm going to make some sourdough bread. And they kind of chuckle and say, what are you going to take 2 vacation days? You're going to call in sick for the next 2 days of work? And you disappear into the kitchen. They hear a little racket in there. And 30 minutes later, you come back into the family room and your family says, I thought you were going to make sourdough bread. And you say, I just did. So the first step in this process is we're going to mix all the ingredients and prepare the dough for an overnight bulk fermentation. This preparation step takes me about 25 minutes to prepare everything. Then that dough will bulk ferment at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius. And then the next morning, I'm looking for about a 75% rise in the dough. I'll go through this bulk fermentation step in a little bit more detail later. What we're really focused on now is preparing the dough. The only things that I prepare in advance, one, is you have to have your starter ready to go when you plan to mix the dough at night. So you have to think ahead a little bit so your starter is either prepared in the morning and then peaking when you're ready to mix the dough, or if you're home midday, you can mix your starter midday. I'm not going to go into all the details of how to prepare your starter for baking. I can do that in a separate video. The only other thing I prepare in advance is I have a printout of this cheat sheet. I use this all the time for all my baking. It has a shorthand version of my recipe on here, and it has all the steps in the baking process. You can download this off of my website. Now, I'm also going to go through a lot of details in this step, and I'm going to do it fairly quickly. Don't feel like you have to write all this down. There's also going to be a companion guide for this on the website when the video launches. So if you've seen my other videos, you know I'm a big fan of Chad Robertson's Basic Country Loaf recipe. We're going to use that as the standard recipe here with a few minor modifications. So here's the Tartine recipe on the left. 400 grams of flour, broken down 90% into bread flour, 10% whole wheat flour. 300 grams of water, that's 75% hydration relative to the flour weight. 8 grams of salt, that's 2%. And 80 grams of starter, that's 20% relative to the flour weight. You can adjust the flour total if you want to make a 500 gram loaf, a 300 gram loaf, and then just adjust those percentages. The Tartine recipe calls for 85° Fahrenheit or 29 degrees Celsius water temperature because he's trying to hit a dough temperature when you're done mixing and throughout bulk fermentation of 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius. So the concept behind Tartine is a warm, fast bulk fermentation. Where we're going to change things up here is we want to do a cool, slow bulk fermentation. So these are these adjustments. Instead of 80 grams of starter, we're using 60 grams of starter. That's 15% starter relative to the flour weight. Instead of 85° water, we're going to use 60° Fahrenheit or 16° water temperature. That's going to give us a dough temperature at the end of mixing, and we want to keep this throughout bulk fermentation of 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. That's our target fermentation temperature for overnight. This is going to be critically important, and that's what will give us our cool, slow bulk fermentation. Now, when I demonstrate the process, you're going to see that I'm using 3 bags of flour because I'm actually blending 2 different types of bread flour for that 90%. So here are the details of the flour that I'm using in this recipe today. I won't go through all of these in detail. It's here for your reference, but you definitely want to use a high protein flour, at least 12.5% protein level, when you do these overnight fermentations. Now, the best way to explain this 25-minute mixing and dough preparation process is to actually do it. So I'm going to do every step of the process. I'm going to just let the camera roll. I'm going to set a timer so you can see how long it takes and all the steps that I'm doing. And then I'll edit the video down just by speeding up the steps. I'm not going to cut anything out of this. You're actually going to see the entire 25-minute process, but we'll get it through it a little quicker than that. I haven't prepared anything in advance other than my starter. My kitchen is completely clean. I haven't done any other prior prep work. Now, I'm going to be moving, I'd say, at a fairly steady pace here, but you don't want to rush when you do this because that's when you make mistakes. That's when you forget things. I'd suggest when you do this process the first time, expect that it might take you 40 minutes, then you might shave it down to 35 minutes, down to 30 minutes. I mean, I've been doing this for a while. I got it down to 25 minutes. That's about as good as I can do without really rushing and being hasty. Now, I'm going to be a little busy as I'm going through this process, so I've invited my twin brother to narrate to you what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So let me set my timer. Here we go. Okay, the first thing he does here is he gets a silicone countertop mat. He puts this on the counter. It helps keep his flour from flying all over the kitchen. It gives him a grippy surface under his mixing bowls and a gripping surface for shaping. It's optional, but he really loves this mat. I think he's used it in every video he's made. Now he gets his digital kitchen scale, and he's going to bring out his bowls that he needs. For mixing, he wants to use the largest bowl that he has because that keeps your flour from flying out of the bowl. He uses a second large bowl to mix his dry ingredients. He uses a water measuring vessel, and he uses a small vessel here for measuring his salt. Now he goes to the pantry for his dry ingredients. He brings out 3 bags of flour, Central Milling High Mountain High Gluten Flour, Central Milling Artisan Baker's Craft Plus, Central Milling Whole Wheat Flour. These were indicated in that prior chart. He also has salt there in that small container with the blue cap. His starter and his starter spoon. That's all the ingredients he needs except for the water. He uses filtered water out of his refrigerator. He's getting 300 milliliters or 300 grams of water here. per the recipe, but he actually overfills that to about 600 milliliters because he's going to use that to wet his hands during the shaping or during the mixing process. He needs a couple other tools, a dough whisk and a bowl scraper. Now he is ready to measure his dry ingredients. He starts with measuring the flour. He uses 260 grams of the Central Milling Company High Mountain High Gluten flour. That's 65% of the total flour weight. He uses 100 grams of Central Milling Company Artisan Baker's Craft Plus. Those two together give him that 90% of total flour weight in bread flour. He's essentially creating his own bread flour blend between those two. And then he tops it off with 40 grams of whole wheat flour, which is 10% of the total flour mixture. Now he's measuring his salt. He's looking for 8 grams of salt. That's 2% of the total flour weight. Now he combines the salt into the flour right from the start here, and then he mixes up all those dry ingredients together, the 3 types of flour and his salt in that glass mixing bowl. Now he's ready for his wet ingredients. He starts with his water. He's using 300 milliliters or 300 grams of water here. That's 75% of the flour weight per the recipe. Now he uses 60 grams of starter. That's 15% of the flour weight. That 15%, he's going to talk about this later in the video, but he determines what percentage of starter to use so that he can time the bulk fermentation based on the overnight temperature to get this dough to perfectly rise at the right time the next morning. Now he vigorously mixes up the water and starter. You want your starter to fully distribute in your water for the best fermentation. Now he's ready to mix in the flour. This is where things can get messy, where people start to splash flour outside of the bowl. So he only pours in about 2/3 of the flour initially. He swirls this around in the bowl. He's not really vigorously mixing. He's just trying to hydrate that flour. When there's no dry flour left visible, he then adds the last 1/3. Again, this is where you want to be careful that you're not getting flour all over your kitchen. He's just carefully turning that flour into the wet mixture here to try to get all the dry flour to come off the sides of the bowl. He's not really vigorously mixing. He's just pushing that dough against the side, trying to absorb all the flour into that water and wet mixture. As soon as that dry flour comes off the bowl, he just spilled a little bit outside of the bowl there. That's a 2-point deduction. After all that dry flour comes out of the bowl, he's going to put this then onto the mat. There it is. And he's going to mix this by hand. He's going to use a technique called the slap and fold method. This was popularized by Richard Bertinet. It's a more aggressive way to hand mix your dough, a very quick way to mix the dough, and it starts to build gluten early in the process. He cleans off his dough whisk and his spoon. He puts a strainer in the bottom of the sink because you are going to get some dough bits in the sink here, but he also puts that white bowl in the sink so he can wash his hands and utensils in the white bowl before they go down the drain. He wets his hands, he pushes all that flour together, he cleaned up that dry flour that he spilled. Now for the slap and fold method, think about this as compass points, north and south, east and west. He's going to grab the dough north and south, slap it east and west. Grab it north and south, turn and slap. Grab it, turn it, slap it. Slap and fold. Slap and fold. Slap and fold. That's how it got the name, the slap and fold method. Now, in this initial process, he's counting the number of times he's doing it there. That was 10. In this initial part of the slap and fold process, all he's trying to do is combine the ingredients, just mix the flour, water, and salt and starter. So what he's feeling for here is any bits of dry flour or clumps or lumps of dry flour in that mixture. So about the first 50 times is what it takes to just get that homogeneous mix. This is just like mixing in a bowl, but you do it much more quickly. This is less than 1 minute of mixing. We're only 8 minutes since he started the process. Now he keeps slapping and folding here, and what he's trying to do is get that homogeneous mixture, and you should feel the dough start to tighten up. You can see that ball's getting a little bit smaller, but then the dough will start to loosen up and get sticky, and that's when he wants to stop. So he's slapping and folding, and here you can see it's getting a little stickier, sticking to his hands more. 90 times, still going. And you can see how he pulls the top apart, that at the top with his left and right hand. You want to get that flap to go over the top. This is starting to get more sticky on his hands. He's stopping there at 100 times. That's pretty typical for this initial round of slap and folds. Now, very important, he takes a 3-minute rest. Alexa, set a timer for 3 minutes. He's going to let the dough rest on the countertop here, and that lets the gluten continue to develop. So he has a 3-minute rest period here. He cleans his hands off in the sink into that white bowl. So he's catching those bits in the bowl. He starts to clean up his work now. He puts away his digital scale. He puts away his dry ingredients, the flour and the salt. He puts away his starter. He puts away his salt cup. He wipes out the dry ingredient mixing bowl, puts that away. Now, he still has a little bit of time left in this 3-minute rest period, so he starts thinking about what can he prepare for tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning, he needs to do shaping. What does he need for shaping? He needs a shaping basket. There's his banneton. He needs a linen towel to put inside the shaping basket. He dusts this towel with a 50-50 mix of bread flour and rice flour. He already has that pre-mixed in a shaker. He put that away already. You barely saw it. He has his banneton, his shaping basket, floured and ready. Now he wants to organize his materials for tomorrow. So he gets out a baking sheet. He puts his floured shaping basket, his bench scraper, and he has a little container of 100% bread flour that he uses to dust the loaves with. 69 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 20.6 degrees Celsius. My water was 58 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 16 degrees Celsius. By using that water temperature out of his refrigerator, it's usually at around 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 degrees Celsius. That gets him that 70 degree Fahrenheit or 21 degree Celsius target dough temperature. Now he thinks about, he still has time left. What can he do for the next day? Oh, the timer's up there. He got his Dutch oven out. Now he goes back to slap and fold round 2. Now in the second round of slapping and folding, this usually doesn't take as many times. What he's doing, look at the dough. Look how smooth that is. You can see the dough coming together. That rest period is almost as important as the slap and fold because the rest is what allows the gluten to then form up and tighten up. Now he works it, but look here, he gets that little donut hole that opens up. It typically happens at about the 15th slap and fold on the second round. Just keep powering through it. Look at that dough tightening up. That ball's getting smaller, tighter, and smoother. The dough's not sticking to his hands now. He's at 30. We're only 13 minutes into the process here. You want that dough to tighten up, and he's feeling, is it getting tighter or looser? Tighter or looser? And then it'll start to get loose again, so he stops. 40 slap and folds on round 2. Very typical. He tightens up that ball. He has another 3-minute rest period here to let that dough continue to develop. So what does he do now in the 3-minute rest period? He continues getting the items that he needs for scoring and baking. He has his lamb. He has a 100% rice flour in a shaker. He's going to use that to dust the bottom of the loaf. He also uses sesame seeds on his loaves, so he has a water spritzer, 2 types of sesame seeds. He has these ready to go. Now he should be cutting a piece of parchment paper to put under the loaf in the Dutch oven, and he's moving those to the safe storage area. It looks like he forgot the parchment paper. I hope he remembers that. Now the Dutch oven's sitting on the counter. It doesn't need to be on the counter. The next time he needs that, it needs to be in the oven. So he puts it in the Dutch oven, put the Dutch oven in the oven right now, just to leave it there until he's ready to preheat. Now, he still forgot the parchment paper. He's going to washing. He's washing his dough whisk. He's washing his starter spoon. He neatly folds his towel. Now he cleans out that white bowl. He kind of splashes the water out of the bowl. Then when you get most of the water out of the bowl, you can scrape up the bits with a paper towel. He didn't have a lot of bits in there, so he dumped it. He puts that bowl away, and then he goes back to the sink with a paper towel, and he'll wipe out the dough bits off of that strainer, and then those go into the trash. And then lastly, he cleans off that strainer and puts it away. Look at where we are, 17 minutes in, and he's got everything, all the mixing tools completely cleaned and put away, and he neatly folds his drying towel. Now, looks like the 3 minutes are up. He's back for slap and fold round 3. This is the third and final round. Now look at that dough. Look how smooth it is. Look how supple it is. That dough really changes with each one of those 3-minute rests. So what he's doing here is, again, he wants that dough to tighten up, but you'll see here, it starts to first come apart. You get the donut hole, keep going. He just powers through that. Now that dough will pull back a little bit and get tighter. Look at that. Look how small and tight that ball is becoming. It's getting tighter, it's getting taller. That's what you want to see. Look how tight that's getting. That's gorgeous. Tighter. Let's get a view from the front, 30 times in. Look at that. Look how tall that dough is now. This is just minutes from when he started this process. Look at that dough. Beautifully developed gluten. A tall, tight ball, 40 times. Looks like he's stopping at 40. He tightens it up. That's it. Slap and fold round 3 is done. Now he's ready to prepare the dough for bulk fermentation. He dumps out his water vessel, but he does not dry this and put it away because he uses that water vessel as his bulk fermentation vessel because it has the milliliter markers on it. So he's going to measure the percent rise in the dough overnight. He's looking for a 75% rise. So he wants to get a really good starting reading here. He tamps the dough down and he can get an initial starting reading. 600 milliliters is the starting point for him. He still forgot about the parchment paper. He's 19 minutes in, but he's really flying. He takes the dough temperature. It's exactly at the target, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius. He's pretty good at this. He puts away the bowl scraper. He cleans the countertop. He covers the bulk fermentation vessel with an elastic food cover. He's cleaning up his mat. He's putting away his silicone. He's 20 minutes in. I mean, he's flying through there it is. He remembered the parchment paper. He does a bifold. He turns it, does another bifold. Now he wants to cut this so that it'll fit under the dough in the Dutch oven and have 2 flaps on the sides. He does something unique here called the piano cut, where he cuts this in the shape of the top of a grand piano. Watch this. Look at that. Looks just like a piano. You open it up, there it is. Fits perfectly under the dough with the 2 flaps. 21 minutes he's flying. He puts away the parchment paper. He cleans the countertop. This usually takes 25 minutes. This is unbelievable. He folds his towel. He neatly puts it away. That's it. 21 minutes. I have 4 minutes to spare. The kitchen's completely clean. He's looking for something to do. What's he doing here? Oh my God, he's cleaning the floor. 22 minutes. This is incredible. He's on a record pace here. This is a world record for this process. He's going to do this in 22 minutes. This is unbelievable. 22 minutes. That's it. Tom, you just broke the record. 22 minutes. He can't hear me up in the booth. Hey, Tom. Tom, you just broke the record. Yeah, congratulations. 22 minutes. Wait, hold on. Hold on. They're reviewing the videotape. It looks like you did not set a timer on that second 3-minute rest period. It was actually 2 minutes and 48 seconds, so you're disqualified. Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry about that, buddy. Yeah. Actually, it was 3.5 minutes. I'm just messing with them. Maybe I'll tell them later. Here's a summary of the steps and process you just saw. You can also find a printed copy of this in the companion guide on the website at thesourdoughjourney.com. Now, the last part of this process before we complete this major step is to set up our dough for overnight bulk fermentation. Now, the overnight fermentation is one of the key elements of this method that really makes it different, and it's one of the benefits because we're doing a completely unattended bulk fermentation. There are no stretch and folds, there's no monitoring the dough. You're basically making sourdough while you sleep. But to make that work, we have to get this set up properly so that it ends at the right time in the morning as expected. So the way that the nominal plan works here, we mixed our dough temperature to 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. We need to maintain a kitchen temperature overnight of 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. And then the next morning, we're going to look for a 75% rise in the dough. And if it's risen 75%, usually in about 10 to 12 hours, then the dough is ready for pre-shaping and final shaping. Now, you might say, What if my overnight dough temperature isn't 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius? Or what if that 10 to 12 hour window doesn't work for me? What if I need to mix the dough at 9 o'clock at night and I need to pre-shape at 6 o'clock? There are different ways to dial in this timing, and it's one of the critical skills that you have to learn to use this method. So I have a chapter near the end of this video where we're going to talk about all the variables that you can use to dial this in to speed up or slow down the fermentation overnight based on your kitchen temperature and the amount of time that you need so that you can catch this in the morning before you go to work. But for our purposes here, our dough is at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius. I can maintain my kitchen temperature all night at that same temperature. We're going to come back in the morning. This should be at a 75% rise, and then we're going to pre-shape this. So at this point in the process, a lot of people are kind of skeptical and ask the question, how can this possibly work? I mean, if you learned using the Tartine method, which I did, I mean, I made 40 videos on this topic, I was skeptical that this process would work until I actually did it. So first, let's just compare the two in terms of time. If I followed the Tartine method, I would mix the dough, I would do 5 rounds of stretch and folds with 30 minutes rests in between those. I'm in the kitchen for 3 hours and 17 minutes before I get to this point in the process where I can leave the dough unattended. Under this method, we do 25 minutes, 3 rounds of slap and folds, very aggressive gluten development up front, no additional handing. I'm out of the kitchen in 25 minutes. Then you ask the question, well, how does that impact the outcome? I mean, what is this loaf going to look like? You saw the video, you saw the photo of these loaves earlier in the video. They look very similar to my Tartine loaves. I mean, sometimes when I go back through my photo album, I have a hard time telling the difference of which ones I made using Tartine versus this method. But there are 2 subtle differences with this method. Typically, these loaves will not be as tall as the classic Tartine loaf because we're not doing those stretch and folds where we're building the dough height. So these loaves tend to sit slightly flatter. And the second difference is in the crumb. With this method, you get a bit more consistent crumb. You don't get the wild open crumb that you sometimes get with the Tartine method. So what's the big difference? Is that worth almost 3 hours more time in the kitchen? So if you put me on the spot and said, Tom, which method do you recommend? I'd say it depends. If I were entering a loaf into an Instagram beauty contest for the tallest, most beautiful, wild open crumb sourdough loaf, and I'm competing against the best bakers in the world for the most aesthetically pleasing loaf, I use the Tartine method. But if I want to make a really nice looking loaf of bread that I can make a sandwich with, that I can toast, that I can use with a pasta dinner, I use this method. It cuts 3 hours of kitchen time out. This has risen 75%, which is our target. It's right at that 1,000 milliliter marker line, but it's domed up above the top of that. So I call that 1,050 milliliters, which is our 75% rise from our starting point of 600 milliliters. The average overnight dough temperature was 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. So now let's imagine it's a weekday morning. Here's the process. Let me start my timer. I pour myself a cup of coffee. I come out, I assess my dough. I look for the percent rise. It's at 75%, exactly where I want to be. Now I need my shaping tools. Where are they? I prepared everything last night. I have my floured banneton, I have my dough scraper, I have my bench knife, and I have some flour for dusting if needed. So I'm basically going to pour this out onto my countertop. As I take this out of the bulk fermentation vessel, look at the gluten strands in here. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but I'm seeing tremendous gluten strands, so I want to handle this very delicately and not degas the dough. And with these long overnight bulk fermentations with a high gluten, high protein percentage flour, you're going to see those gluten strands like that. Normally, I would panic if I saw these, if I was bulk fermenting at 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius, because when you see that gluten at warm temperatures, this dough has gone too far. At low temperatures, you can handle seeing that gluten. Now, I want height because I did not do any handling of this dough after that initial mixing. My pre-shaping is all about building height. So I basically Take the 4 sides of this, stack them on top of each other. Then I'm going to roll this over. Now I want to build surface tension. There it is. I cover this with a towel. I like to use this towel I picked up in Italy in the fair city of Verona. I let this sit. I do need to wash my bulk fermentation vessel. Let me do that. The dishes are cleaned and put away. That whole process took 3 minutes and 45 seconds. Now we let this rest for 30 minutes. I've set a 30-minute timer and I'm going to get ready for work. It's been 30 minutes. I gotta go to work. But first I gotta shape up this dough. Don't ask me what kind of work I do. Let me just say it's a family business. Okay, my dough has been resting for 30 minutes. Let's do a final shape. I use very little flour, not just because I always dress in black, but because I like to keep my kitchen clean. Just lightly flour this surface. Flip the dough. This feels beautiful. Wow, really gorgeous dough. I pull this into a rectangle. I'm going to shape this as a batard. It's my typical style. This dough feels pretty proofy, meaning pretty far along. It's really soft. I pinch the ends. I give it a little tuck. Dust the top. I have my pre-floured shaping basket ready to go. Do a little shake. Looks good. Cover it. Into the fridge. Clean up my work. Clean my countertop. Put away my mat. Now I need to go do a job. Go to my job. Okay, let's bake some bread. Now where are we in the process? If you recall, step 1, mix the ingredients, 25 minutes total prep time. Let that dough bulk ferment overnight at a cool temperature. By the next morning it had risen 75%, pre-shaped it, bench rested, final shape, put that dough into the refrigerator. Once it's in the refrigerator, you can bake that dough anytime from 1 to 3 days. So I have a number of loaves in the refrigerator that have been in there for different times. I'm going to start taking them out and baking them so you can see what the loaves look like. The process I use for baking, textbook Tartine. My Dutch oven was already in the oven. I preheat it to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. As soon as the oven reaches that temperature, I take my dough out of the refrigerator, I score it, I load it into the Dutch oven, cover it, reduce the temperature to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, 232 degrees Celsius, bake it for 20 minutes with the lid on, then I take the lid off, bake it for another 20 minutes until it's done. Let me get my loaf out of the refrigerator. So here's my dough from the refrigerator. This has been in the fridge for 48 hours. So now let's think back about how this process worked. Let's say it's Saturday morning and you want to bake this dough at 8 o'clock Saturday morning. I'm going to go back in time and figure out my timeline. So Wednesday evening, let's say at 8 p.m., I do my 25-minute process. I mix all of my ingredients. I let that bulk ferment overnight. Thursday morning, I pre-shape and final shape. I put that into the refrigerator as my final shape dough for the cold retard. This has been in the refrigerator Thursday morning, Friday morning, now it's Saturday morning, 48 hours later. What does the dough look like? Now you can see here, this dough puffed up a little bit in the refrigerator. So when you put your dough in the refrigerator, it's going to continue fermenting, and when you leave it in the refrigerator for, say, 2 days or 3 days, we're at 2 days right now, it's going to continue to ferment. But if your refrigerator is cold enough, typically 37 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 degrees Celsius, this dough will not overproof in the refrigerator for even up to 3 days, sometimes longer. Let's test this out and see. Where are all my tools for scoring and baking? I organized all that on Wednesday night. Let me grab those. Here's everything I need. We planned ahead. So the first thing that I do is I want to take the temperature of this dough to just double check what my refrigerator temperature is at. Now this has been in there 48 hours. So this is 42 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 degrees Celsius. My refrigerator temperature is set to 37 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 degrees Celsius. You will have different hot spots and cool spots in your refrigerator. This was on my top shelf, which tends to be a warmer spot in my refrigerator. You can put different small thermometers in your refrigerator to test the temperature at different locations. It's helpful to do that, especially if you're going to be leaving your dough in the refrigerator for 2 or 3 days. I still don't think this overproofed, even though it's sitting at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. I dust the bottom of my loaf with rice flour. I already have my rice flour here in a shaker. I have my pre-cut parchment paper. I flip this dough out onto my parchment paper. Remove my shaping basket. Oh, that's a gorgeous loaf. I mean, look how tall that's standing up. I mean, just at first glance, that does not have any indications of overproofing at all. And we made this a long time ago. Now, I like to put sesame seed on my loaf. This is purely optional. The way I do this is I have this little spritzer of water. I spritz my loaf. These can be a little messy. If you really want to avoid mess in the kitchen, avoid the sesame seeds, but I love the flavor. So it's a little bit of a sacrifice that I make based on personal preference. I like a mix of regular sesame seeds and black sesame seeds for a little bit of a dramatic visual effect. Now I score the loaf. I just do a simple slash just right of center, a little bit of a sweeping arc. That dough feels beautiful. Now, I observe this when it opens up. Now, when your slash opens up, I look down in here and you can see that webbing, you can see the interior of the loaf. This loaf is pushing towards a little bit proofy, just based on the way that opens up, but that's about what I would expect after having been in the refrigerator for 48 hours. It's not completely flattening out. So let me put this into the oven, we'll bake it, and that's when we'll really know the whole story. So that took me about 5 minutes to do that process. Now I put everything away. Sesame seed. Now this pan, which I use to organize my materials, is also part of the baking process. I put this in under the Dutch oven to keep the bottom from burning. Some ovens have a heating element on the bottom, so you put this as a heat shield on a separate rack under your Dutch oven rack. I don't preheat this in the oven because I don't want this to heat up. I'll put it in right now after I get the dough in. Here we go. You want to clean up all those sesame seeds because those will end up everywhere. They're my nemesis. So my kitchen's clean again, everything is put away. Here at the Institute, there's a place for everything. Everything's in its place. That's how we roll. But now I have to wait 20 minutes to take that lid off. So I can't depart or venture too far away from the kitchen because I need to be here when that alarm goes off to take the lid off. This is what I call attended time. Even though it's not hands-on time, you can fill up this time doing something else productive. A good example would be, if you have 20 minutes to spare, you could start watching a video I created called The Secrets of Oven Spring and Baking Temperature. This is an extraordinary experiment I did a couple of months ago where I baked 6 different loaves at different baking times, temperatures, and different types of baking vessels. It's really a great video to watch if you want to fine-tune your baking process to get optimal oven spring. Now, speaking of that video, there's a real interesting experiment in there which can help you reduce, again, your time in the kitchen. It's a method created by Elaine Body at FoodBod where she does something called the cold start method. I didn't believe that this would work, but it actually does. She basically doesn't preheat the oven. So in the morning, you can get up, have your cold Dutch oven, take your cold dough out of the refrigerator, put the cold dough in the cold Dutch oven, put it in the cold oven, and bake it with the lid on in the Dutch oven at 450 degrees Fahrenheit, 232 degrees Celsius for 55 minutes with the lid on. That's a long time. Then you take the lid off at 55 minutes, and it only takes about 5 to 10 minutes at the end to do the final browning. That method actually works. I really was a skeptic until I did it, but when you think about reducing time in the kitchen, that reduces another 30 minutes of preheating time because I don't need to preheat my Dutch oven. I literally wake up, put the dough in, turn the oven on, and I can walk away for 55 minutes. One other interesting use of technology is that my oven allows me to program it to tell it when to start preheating. So I can go to sleep at night and tell my oven to start preheating to 500 degrees Fahrenheit or 260 degrees Celsius at 7:30 in the morning. I know that it takes about 25 or 30 minutes for my Dutch oven to heat up in the oven. My Dutch oven was already in the oven. I put it in there 2 days ago. So my oven will automatically turn on at 7:30. I can get up at 7:55, take my dough out of the fridge, score it, oven's ready. Boom, I just saved another 30 minutes where I wasn't in the kitchen. So this loaf is done baking. It baked for 20 minutes with the lid on and 17 minutes with the lid off. Let's take a look. People, look at this. Look at this loaf. No stretch and folds, no lamination, no coil folds, no fermentolyse, no autolyse. I spent 25 minutes Wednesday night, 8 minutes of hands-on time, 35 minutes of elapsed time Thursday morning. Put this in the refrigerator and forgot about it for 2 days. I just baked this. I mean, this kind of brings tears to my eyes, not just because it's a gorgeous loaf, but because so many people used to bake these and they stopped baking because they think it's too hard, it's too messy, it takes too long. If you know somebody who learned to bake during the pandemic and they quit, call them, email them, text them, send them a telegram. This method works. I mean, you can't really screw it up. That low bulk fermentation temperature, high protein flour, and then that long cold retard in the fridge, I mean, it just works. It works. So this loaf has cooled. Let's cut it open and take a look at the crumb. Again, that's just a spectacular loaf. You can see the blistering on the side there. You got an ear on the top. I mean, a really super looking loaf of bread. Let's cut it open. Wow, gorgeous. That's a beautiful loaf. Very consistent crumb, a nice ear, decent shape, and again, remember, no stretch and folds, no coil folds, no autolyse, no fermentolyse. I mean, we cut a lot of steps out of here and really got a really nice looking loaf here. So at this point, most other videos would congratulate themselves on making a beautiful looking loaf. They would say good luck, and this would be the end of the video. We don't operate that way here at the Institute. There's still more work to be done. So I have 2 more sections to follow. One is I'm going to teach you the basics of how to get started and how to bake your first loaf using this method. Then I'll go through a section that talks about how to dial in that overnight bulk fermentation timing to get your dough to hit that perfect rise point at exactly the right time. Now, if you want to be successful at this method, you have to master a couple of new skills. One of them is measuring the percent rise in the dough. This is the easiest one. Now, if you're familiar with a lot of my other videos, I have a series called When is Bulk Fermentation Done, where I introduced this tool called the Incredible Bulk-O-Matic System, where you use 9 criteria to determine when bulk fermentation is finished. Now, this is really essential when you're following something like the Tartine process, where you're bulk fermenting dough at 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius, because you have to watch that dough as it gets close to the end of bulk fermentation, because it can start overproofing in a 30-minute window, sometimes less. So that's where you're really monitoring the dough closely. You need a tool like this. For this process, we're simplifying things by bulk fermenting at a lower temperature, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, you have a much wider window to cut off the end of bulk fermentation. And if you really focus on just measuring the percentage rise in the dough during bulk fermentation, That will get you really close to finding the optimal cutoff point. So I just want to simplify things and say for purposes of this process, all we're focused on is measuring the percent rise. However, you have to measure it accurately. So when I ask people, how do you measure the percent rise in the dough? Some people say, I just look at the dough in my bowl and I kind of eyeball it. This is not acceptable. You can't measure the actual percentage rise in a bowl like this because it's flared out at the top. So even if you could assess the height increase in the dough, that's not the same as the increase in volume. We need to measure the change in volume, not height. Worse yet, some people use a bowl like this where you can't even look through the side of it. Unacceptable. What I recommend is these measuring containers. So this is the one that I used in the video. This is a 1 liter measuring cup. These are perfect for one batch of dough. 600 milliliters is my starting point in this example. I'm looking for a 75% rise in this scenario. So I'm going up to 1,050 milliliters, which is just the top of that top line there. These are fantastic. If you're making a batch of 2 loaves at a time and you say, I need something bigger, they make bigger bowls with milliliter markers on them. This is a 2 liter bowl. I use this when I use the Tartine method. I go all the way up to 2,000 milliliters. Just find something with the milliliter markers on it. If you say, I really don't want to spend the money, is there another way I can do it? There is. You can create your own bowl with milliliter markers on it. Here's how you do it. Take your kitchen scale, take a bowl and put a piece of tape on the side of it. Put your bowl on the scale and then pour water into here and measure 100 grams, 200 grams, 300 grams, 400 grams, etc. When you measure the weight of water equals the milliliters of water, the volume of water. That's how the metric system is designed. It's designed around the density of water. So as you pour that in, just mark little hash marks on your blue tape here, and you can turn any vessel into a measuring vessel by doing this little trick. Now here's an example of another measuring vessel that I made. This is a plastic food storage container, and I used that water filling trick on the scale to put my own milliliter markers on here. The benefit of a tall, thin vessel like this is you can see the percent rise a little bit more evidently. So if you're trying to really dial in the difference between a 75% rise and an 80% rise, it's a little easier to do it on a tall, thin vessel versus the low, flat vessels like this. The only downside is that it's a little more difficult to get the dough out of here when you're doing pre-shaping. So that's a little bit of a trade-off. And then the last question that people often ask is, how do you really get a good starting point reading on the dough? Because a lot of times the dough is domed up on top after the slap and folds when you put it in the vessel. You saw what I did was I wet my hand and I try to push the dough down to really flatten it to get that starting measurement in milliliters. But there's also another trick you can use. This is a calculation that I've done many times, and that is if you follow this Tartine recipe with the 75% hydration, which is what I always do, the starting volume in milliliters is equal to the starting weight of the flour in grams times 1.5. So we saw that in this example. We mixed up 400 grams of flour. My starting volume was 400 times 1.5, 600 milliliters. It works every time. 500 gram flour weight recipe starts at 750 milliliters. 1,000 gram flour weight recipe, 1,500 milliliters. That 1.5 measurement is so consistent that a lot of times I don't even try to flatten the dough down anymore. I just know from my recipe, if I take the flour weight times 1.5, that's going to be my starting volume in milliliters. Now it's finally time for you to make your first loaf using this method. If you work Monday through Friday, I recommend that you start this on a Friday evening. So after work, after dinner, get your kitchen set up. Don't worry about trying to do this in 25 minutes. The main thing the first time you do this is to get a feel for that slap and fold method. That's a key new skill that you want to develop. Follow the recommendations that I gave earlier in the video in terms of the number of times to do the slap and fold and that rest time in between, at least 3-minute rest. Once your dough is done with the slap and fold method, you want to have created your measuring vessel or bought one of these vessels. Put your dough in here. Your starting point should be 600 milliliters or something close to that if you use the same recipe that I use. Now, you need to maintain the dough temperature overnight. Now, I recommend 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. the first time you do this method, don't go crazy trying to hit that number exactly. Try to get it within a window of 68 degrees Fahrenheit to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 20 degrees Celsius to 22 degrees Celsius. Try to find someplace in your home where the dough can maintain that temperature overnight. Now, the most critical thing that we need to do with this first bake is to validate that that 75% rise in the dough works with your starter and your flour. So after you've baked the loaf, let it cool for 90 minutes, then you're going to cut it open and you're going to assess the crumb. The crumb will tell you if the loaf is overproofed or underproofed. How do you know how to read a sourdough crumb? I have a whole separate video on this topic. I have a printable guide. This part's really easy. Watch the video, print the guide. After you take that first loaf out, you cut it, you say, is it underproofed or overproofed or nicely proofed? If it's underproofed, then the next time you do the percent rise, go up to 85% rise. If it's overproofed, which would be unlikely, then you want to reduce that percent rise in your overnight fermentation and get it down to 65% rise. So you're basically doing a 10 percentage point increase or decrease if the loaf is over or underproofed each time you bake, and after a few bakes you'll dial this in. I'd say for 90+% of the people out there, the percent rise that you're going to look for overnight is going to be somewhere between 75% and 100% rise. You can get there in 3 tries. Then once you figure out what that optimal percent rise is for your starter and your flour with this recipe, let's say for example you had to push yours up to 85% rise to get a fully proofed crumb, it never changes. Assuming you can keep your dough temperature in that range, it will always be the same. So now this is the way you make sourdough bread. 25 minutes, slap and fold, put the dough in the bowl, let it sit overnight, check it in the morning, catch it at 85%. It'll always work. You'll always get the same results. I mean, it's a small miracle. But there's always a but with this guy. It depends on the dough temperature. The percent rise is inextricably linked to the dough temperature. You can't separate those things. So now let's talk about the impact of dough temperature on this process. One of the most confusing things in all of sourdough baking is how some recipes call for a 30% rise in the dough, others call for a 100% rise in the dough. This one calls for a 75% rise in the dough, and they all make the same looking loaf of bread. How is that possible? I mean, how is that even conceivable? The reason is because they bulk ferment at different dough temperatures. The percent rise is related to the dough temperature. I made a whole video on this topic in my When is Bulk Fermentation Done series. It's episode 8. Check that out if you really want to see the details on this. But basically, if you're bulk fermenting your dough at a warm temperature, like in the Tartine method, that requires a dough temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius, that calls for a 30% rise in the dough, very low. And that's when you cut off bulk fermentation. If you follow Elaine Body's Food Bod Master recipe, she bulk ferments at 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 20 to 21 degrees Celsius. She calls for a doubling of the dough. How can you get the same results with a 30% rise and a 100% rise? Because of the dough temperature. So what happens is, when you're bulk fermenting at a warm temperature, when you call the end of bulk fermentation, like in Tartine, your dough is 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 27 degrees Celsius, it's fermenting like crazy. It's rapidly rising, fermenting, and the yeast is reproducing at a rapid rate. You call bulk fermentation is done at 30%, then you pre-shape the dough, it keeps fermenting. You let it sit for 30 minutes on the countertop, it keeps fermenting. You final shape the dough, it keeps fermenting. You put it in the refrigerator, it keeps fermenting. It takes a long time to get that dough temperature down to the refrigerator temperature, usually about 8 hours, before that dough finally goes to sleep. So when you're bulk fermenting warm dough, you have to hit the brakes early. You have to cut off bulk fermentation at 30% because it keeps rapidly fermenting until it gets down to fridge temperature. Now in this scenario, I recommend letting the dough rise to 75% because we're bulk fermenting at 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius, so that fermentation curve is a little bit flatter. The dough isn't going crazy, the yeast isn't going crazy, because we're fermenting at a much cooler temperature. Then we put the dough into the refrigerator and it gets down to the refrigerator temperature more quickly than in the Tartine method. So you can let the dough rise more. So 75% at least, some people say go up to 100%. Your answer will be somewhere in that range in all likelihood. So this is the last step in the process. So what have we learned? First, we learned how to mix our dough in 25 minutes, eliminate a lot of wasted time. Number 2, we learned that if we measure the percent rise in our dough, that will produce a consistent crumb every time. Now we're on to step 3. This is the hardest part, but it has the biggest benefit, and that is, how do you make sourdough while you sleep? Because what we need to figure out is how we control that overnight bulk fermentation so it rises at the right time so our dough is ready when we're ready. So now to master the timing of that overnight fermentation, we need to look at how fermentation works end to end. Now we understand part of this that we figured out already. If we measure our bulk fermentation to a consistent percent rise, let that final proof, you'll deliver consistent loaves because 90% of what you see in that finished loaf comes from that rise in the bulk fermentation. But now we want to focus on the time that it takes to get to that percent rise. So we're going to back up one step. And in this example, let's say we have a 12-hour rise is what gives me the 75% rise in the dough. What controls that 12 hours? That's the key thing that we need to focus on now. 2 things. It's the quantity of starter that you're using, and it's the overnight dough temperature. Those 2 things alone control the timing. So now if we can adjust 2 variables, the amount of starter that we're using and the overnight dough temperature, we control time. If we control time, we can make sourdough while we sleep. We can wake up in the morning and our dough will be sitting at the 75% rise exactly at the time we need it to, just by adjusting these 2 variables, the amount of starter that we're using and the overnight dough temperature. So now let's see the model in action. Let's say we want to reduce our bulk fermentation time. I move my starter quantity to the right, my bulk fermentation time goes to the left. It takes less time because I'm using more starter. It doesn't affect the percent rise, it only affects the time. Similarly, if I move my dough temperature to the right, that'll speed things up. If I move my dough temperature to the left, it slows things down. So all we're doing here is controlling time. We know the target percent rise that we need to hit. We know the time window that we need to hit. Because I can say I want to mix my dough at 7 p.m., I want to wake up at 7 a.m., I have to hit a 12-hour window. I can control that. I can really dial that in by controlling the percentage of starter that I use and or the overnight bulk fermentation temperature. So how do we control overnight dough temperature? Always start with your room temperature. So let's say we want to hit that target of 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius. The first thing I want to do is just walk around my house and see if I have a room that stays at that temperature overnight. And this can happen in the summer or winter. You might have a basement, a garage, a laundry room, office, upstairs bathroom, a closet. Walk around your house with these thermometers, let them sit for a bit. You have all kinds of different temperatures in your house overnight. So that's always the first thing that I suggest before you use some kind of apparatus, is just find some place in your house that'll maintain that consistent overnight temperature. You'll be surprised. But let's say that you can't find any room temperature that's going to stay at that 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius target overnight. Then you need to modify your temperature. 2 directions you can go. If it's winter and your house is too cold, you need to warm the dough up. If it's summer, your house is too warm, you need to cool the dough down. Here are some examples of how to do that. So let's say it's winter time, your kitchen is too cold overnight to hit that target temperature range, so we need to warm up the dough. What are some options? One thing a lot of people use is they turn on the light bulb in their oven with the oven temperature turned off with the light bulb on. That'll throw off some heat. Now sometimes that'll be too warm and it'll overshoot this target temperature overnight. But if that's the case, just try cracking your oven door open 2 inches and see what the internal temperature is. Crack the door open 4 inches, crack the door open 6 inches. Sometimes just opening that door with the light on inside, it'll moderate that temperature to the perfect temperature that you're looking for. The other thing people use are these little warming mats. You can buy a seed warming mat, reptile warming mat. This is one specifically for rising dough. You put your dough on this at night, it'll raise the temperature of your dough. If it's too warm to set your dough directly on here, put a cooling rack on top of this and just putting a little air gap under there will control your dough temperature. Always get a good probe thermometer. Make sure that you're testing your dough temperature the first couple times you do this. Once you figure a method out, it's going to work pretty consistently. Here's another example I use when my kitchen's too cold. Put your dough next to a light bulb. I mean, this is so incredibly simple, and this will maintain a real nice temperature overnight. You control the temperature of your dough by controlling how close or how far away you put the bulb, or if you have a dimmable one, you can do that as well. And lastly, the easiest but most expensive method is this Taylor proofing box. I don't know if you've seen these. You basically put your dough in here. It has a thermostat on the side. You set this to 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. This thing works perfectly. I mean, if you really want to dial this in, if you're going to do this all the time, I'd consider making an investment in this. And I know this looks bulky. I hate bulky kitchen tools. Look at this. There it is. A friend gave me this as a gift. Total game changer. But these only will warm your dough. They won't cool it. So now we have to talk about solutions for when you need to cool your dough. So now let's talk about the opposite problem where your kitchen is too warm. So this happens to me during the summer. I'm trying to bulk ferment overnight. My kitchen is very warm because I don't run the air conditioning in my kitchen during the summer, but I do run the air conditioning in my bedroom during the summer. Take your thermometer, walk around the house, find a cool spot in your house. It's a little weird to sleep with your sourdough in your bedroom, but it keeps the temperature down. So that's an option. Find a spot in your house that's cool. The other thing I do in the summer is I use my oven, but not with the light on because that would heat it up. I need to cool it down. What I do is I put my dough in the oven with an ice pack. This will reduce the temperature almost 7 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 3.5 degrees Celsius by putting this little ice pack in there. If it doesn't last long enough, put a big ice pack in there. If you need to cool it down more, put 2 ice packs in there. I mean, test that out with a thermometer. Put a thermometer in there, try the different ice packs, and even though those will thaw out overnight, they'll cool down the dough enough for the first 6, 7, 8 hours where it'll very slowly come back up to your room temperature right as you're waking up. So that's definitely an option. And then lastly, I showed you the Taylor proofing box that you want to use in the winter to warm your dough up. It works perfectly. It's thermostatically controlled. They don't make one of those for the summer. They don't make a cooling one. So I made one myself. Now here's an example of a mini fridge. These are incredibly inexpensive. In the US, you can get these for about $30. Now these are not great refrigerators if you're trying to keep your beer cold. They really don't cool things down to true refrigerator temperature. But for reducing your dough temperature down a couple degrees from room temperature, these are perfect. The only problem is they don't have a thermostat on them. I solved that problem too. You can buy a thermostatic control. These are less than $20. You can hook this up to the mini fridge. I type this in. I say I want to keep the temperature at 70 degrees. If it gets warmer than 70 degrees, it turns it on. Colder than 70 degrees, it turns it off. How does that work? There's this little thermostatic probe. I drilled a hole in the top of the refrigerator. I put this down in there. You can even put this right in the center of the dough. That gives you really the best temperature reading. When the center of the dough gets above 70, it'll turn the refrigerator on. Temperature gets below 70, turns the fridge off. I also made this cool measuring vessel that fits perfectly within the fridge. This is really a great little unit. Maybe I'll make a separate video that shows how to set this up. And one last thing to note is that some of these little mini fridges can work both in heating mode or cooling mode. So this actually has a little heater in it also, which, just like my Taylor proofer, it's a lot more expensive. I can use this in the winter to warm my dough up. Exact same process. But you can only use it one direction or the other. It either runs in cooling mode or in heating mode. You can't get it to switch between both. But if you have a 6th grade child in a STEM program, or if you know an electrical engineer, they could probably hook up one of these thermostats and get this to work as either a heating or a cooling device. Pretty cool. Now in a new development, I recently acquired this laboratory incubator. These are relatively inexpensive, and this is a larger capacity than the mini fridge I just showed. Uniquely, this product heats and cools to a specified temperature, so you can use this year-round. Now, I'll be doing a separate video on this after I assess this product over the next 30 days, so stay tuned, but this is a very promising development for having a consistent tool for year-round overnight temperature control. So now back to the model. We can control the overnight dough temperature in summer or winter if you need to. The other variable is starter quantity. I can control my starter quantity really easily because I just measure the amount I want to put in. So I can control the two variables that influence bulk fermentation time. So why do we need to control bulk fermentation time? It's because that's what frees up our time, when we can make the dough work around our schedule. So here's the classic example. This is what a bulk fermentation curve looks like. Let's say I mix this dough at 7 o'clock at night and I'm measuring the percent rise up to 75%. It gets off to a slow start and then all the action happens at the end. But what I'm trying to do here in this example is I want to hit this window between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning the next day. Now look how small that window is at the very end, where if I undershoot this by an hour, I might only be at a 55% rise. If I overshoot it by an hour, that curve keeps climbing. I might be up to a 90% rise. So the reason we bulk ferment at this 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius target is because it's very difficult to overproof the dough at that temperature. So your margin of error is on the high side. So we want to be at a minimum of 75% by the time we wake up in the morning. But if we're at 85%, 95%, even up to 100% rise, this dough will still not be overproofed. So now you've baked your baseline loaf, you've locked in on what that percentage rise in that gives you a nicely proofed loaf. Now the next step is to figure out how do you control that timing, that overnight bulk fermentation, so that the dough hits that target percent rise in the window that you're trying to hit. For example, if you want to shape the dough on a weekday before you go to work. This is the holy grail of sourdough baking, trying to predict that bulk fermentation time. Now some people have tried to do this. If you go out on the internet, there are some tables and some graphs and some charts that have been created in the past. I've tested all of these and none of them are reliable because most of those are based on a handful of bakes that somebody did. They applied a mathematical model to it and they're very sophisticated mathematical models, but they just don't work consistently across all these dimensions. I've tried them. So then I went to my sourdough baking books. I mean, I have a stack of books this tall. I've bought and read them all. And I thought maybe I had missed something, and maybe in one of these books there was a table or a chart or a formula that shows how do you calculate the amount of starter that you need, the dough temperature that's required to deliver a certain percentage of rise within a given period of time. I looked through all these books and I really couldn't find anything specific to that. What I did find in virtually every book is they say, if you want to speed up your fermentation time, use more starter or increase the dough temperature. If you want to reduce your fermentation time, use less starter or a lower dough temperature. I mean, no offense to my fellow bakers, but no shit, Sherlock. I mean, everybody knows this. The question is, how much? How much does a 5% increase in starter reduce the time? How much does a 5-degree change in temperature reduce the time? That's the question. And more complicated is, what happens when you put both of those together? Because both those variables can change at the same time. So this takes us all the way back to the beginning. Frederick Winslow Taylor, 1909, the father of scientific management. He's an observational scientist. That's where I get my influence. So I said, some people call me Doubting Thomas. Now I know why. I'm going to run the tests. I'm actually just going to do it. So what I did is I built a lab in my basement. In the basement of the Institute here. And I ran dozens and dozens and dozens of tests, mixing up an actual formula based on this recipe. 90% bread flour, 10% whole wheat flour, 75% hydration. I varied the temperature and I varied the starter quantity from 5% up to 20% starter, and I ran multiple tests. I observed these and I even used a pH meter in each sample so I can come back and do a pH validation of the fermentation rate. That's going to be in a whole separate video, but you can use pH meters to also dial in this fermentation rate more specifically. And after many, 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 many tests, I have been able to create these fermentation tables. 2 simple tables to support this process, to help busy people figure out how much starter quantity to use, what dough temperature they need to hit certain fermentation times overnight. The table on the left, this is sorted by the 75% rise time. That's the third column on the table. So let's say you wanted your bulk fermentation time to be 13 hours. You go down that third column till you hit the number 13, go to the left. It says you should use 20% starter at a 66 degree Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius overnight dough temperature that should come in at 13 hours to the 75% rise. I also put the 100% rise time on here so you know how big that window is, kind of that safe zone that you're working with. The table on the right is the same data, but I've just sorted this by temperature because if you know your overnight temperature, let's say your kitchen is 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and you just want to work within that temperature range, you have the 4 options here from 20% starter percentage down to 5% starter percentage. You have a window to work within of 11.5 hours up to 17.5 hours to hit that 75% rise. That's another way to use these tables. Now, these tables were built on a relatively small sample size, actually, when you think about this from a scientific perspective. So I'm continuing to run tests. So rather than doing a screen print of this, go to my website, print out the companion guide for this video. The updated fermentation tables will always be in there. And I'll also publish the fermentation tables as a separate document so you don't need to print the whole guide every time. But I'll continue validating these numbers, updating them, and as the warm weather comes in the summer, I'm going to expand this testing to go up to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So we'll really have a complete model going from 85 degrees Fahrenheit down to 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be wonderful. Now, I've also included a bar chart version here for the more visual people. Your target fermentation hours are listed across the bottom. So you read across the bottom until you get to, say, your target of 13 hours. Then you go up and find the bar that crosses that 13-hour mark. That gives you the option, or actually multiple options, that would put you in that 13-hour range. It could be multiple combinations of starter percentages and overnight dough temperatures. And then this third chart is the same data, just sorted differently, where it's in each one of the temperature groups. So again, if you know what your overnight temperature is going to be, but you want to see what your options are within that temperature range by adjusting the starter percentage, those are your 4 options within each temperature range. I was being a little facetious in that prior segment. The reason people don't publish tables like this is because the moment you publish these, for probably more than half the people who try to use them, they'll say, these tables don't work. The tables are wrong. The table doesn't match what I'm seeing. The reason is because everybody's sourdough starter is different. Even your own starter on 2 different days of the week can be different. And people use different types of flour, and different flour will ferment faster or slower than other types of flour. So you always have that variable underlying any types of tables like this. But what I'm going to do is help you calibrate your starter and your flour to these tables, because what you'll find is if your actual results are different than what are in these tables, they'll always be different by the same ratio. Now, one thing to consider with the strength of your starter is everybody's starter is different, so the strength from one person to the next will be different. But the strength of your starter can also vary day to day. So what I recommend is, at least when you're starting this process, always try to prepare your starter the same way before you use these tables, so at least you're eliminating that variability that could be caused by your own starter being stronger or weaker on different days of the week. And now, just for the record, the way that I ran all these experiments with respect to flour and starter was I used King Arthur bread flour and King Arthur whole wheat flour, 90% bread flour, 10% whole wheat flour. This is the most widely available flour in the US. That's why I chose to use this. So you could replicate this flour exactly. And then for my starter, everybody's starter is different. But what I did was I did a 1-2-2 feeding every morning before I ran these tests. And I used my starter right about at the time that it was peaking. So now you could try to replicate this exactly. You can buy the same flour. You could give your starter the same starter feeding ratio. You could use it right as it peaks. And your results might still be different. If your results are different, it's because of one thing. Your starter strength is different than my starter strength. Everybody's starter is different. Some people have weak starters, some people have strong starters. But if you run a couple of tests, what you'll find is that if it's really down to your starter strength, your differences in the results will be consistently different. Meaning, the first test that you run, let's say your starter takes 10% longer to rise the dough than mine, every test that you do will likely take 10% longer. All that means is your starter is 10% weaker than mine. It's not a bad thing. This is the process of calibration. So now let me give you an example of how you calibrate your flour starter combination against the standard. So now you have the fermentation timetables to use, but you always be aware that your results may differ because of your starter strength and your flour combination. So the first few times you bake, what I recommend is use this worksheet. This is included in the companion guide. This is called a calibration table. And what you're going to do is just record your first few bakes here so you can see if there's a pattern about whether you're higher or lower than the fermentation timetables. So your first bake, you're using 10% starter, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius. The table says that should take 15 hours to hit the 75% rise. Your actual results come in exactly at the temperature. You did a good job of controlling your temperature, but it took 16 hours to hit the 75% rise. So you have a 1 hour variance. That means your time took 1 hour longer than the estimated or standard time. The next time you bake, you do a 15% starter at the same temperature, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius. The table tells you that that should take 13.5 hours to hit 75% rise. Your actuals at that temperature come in at 14.5 hours to hit 75% rise. Another 1 hour variance. I'm seeing a pattern here. Now for the third bake, you use that 15% starter quantity, but now your temperature is 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees Celsius. The tables say that that should take 12.5 hours to hit 75%. You run your actuals, you keep the temperature at that target range. Your actuals come in at 13.5 hours, 1 hour variance. So you've just baked 3 different loaves. You kept some pretty basic information here. I mean, I'm kind of seeing a pattern. I mean, every time you bulk ferment the dough, it takes about an hour longer for your dough to hit the target rise versus what was in the table. If you went and baked a fourth loaf and it called for a 14-hour rise in the table, I'd say there's a pretty high likelihood it's going to take 15 hours. You just did calibration. That's the step. It's done. Now the last step in the model that we haven't talked about yet is final proofing. Now with this method, if you recall, we bulk ferment to the same percent rise every time. In this example, 75%. But you can bake the dough anywhere from 8 hours to 72 hours after the dough goes into the refrigerator. Let's talk about how that actually works. So because I designed this method for busy people, I'm trying to create the largest window possible to give you the option of when to bake these loaves. So once they go into the refrigerator, you could bake it as soon as 8 hours after that or up to 72 hours. That's a 64-hour window. No other recipe or method would suggest this is even possible. So how does this work? So when you bake your first baseline loaf, what I suggest is do a 24-hour cold retard. So let your dough rise to 75% as we discussed. Put it in the refrigerator for 24 hours, bake that up, and then assess that crumb. That'll be your baseline. Then bake a loaf and put it in the refrigerator for 8 hours. That'd be the shortest possible time. Do a third loaf, let it sit in the refrigerator for 72 hours. That would be the longest possible time. And that will let you assess how your dough is behaving over that 8 to 72 hour period, with that 24-hour really being the optimal point. So you want to dial in your percentage rise, that 75%, so that the 24-hour loaf is really perfect. What you'll see is in some cases, your 8-hour loaf might be a little underproofed, and your 72-hour loaf might move a little towards overproofing. It will definitely become more sour. The longer these loaves sit in the refrigerator, the flavor moves to a little more sourness, the loaf will flatten a little bit, and the crumb will start to look a little overproofed, but it's almost impossible to really badly overproof a loaf once it's in the refrigerator. However, you want to be able to dial these in to get a really perfect loaf, either at 8 hours, 24 hours, or anywhere up to 72 hours. There's a very unique method to do that I figured out. Let me share that with you. So everybody's refrigerator is different, but there are a few things that are common. One is when you set your thermostat, I set mine to 37 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 degrees Celsius, there will be warm and cool spots in my refrigerator that are above or below that thermostat setting. This happens in everybody's refrigerators. There's usually only one spot in your refrigerator, the actual thermostat head, that's actually at that target setting, in my case 37 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 degrees Celsius. So what you want to do is figure out where are those warm spots and cool spots in your refrigerator, because we're going to use that to our advantage with these long proofings. So the way that you do this is with what I call the coffee cup test. Fill up 4 coffee cups with water, put these in your refrigerator at different points. top shelf back, top shelf front, center shelf middle, bottom shelf or bottom drawer. Leave that cup of water, 4 cups of water, in your refrigerator for 24 hours, then come back and test the temperature of that water. A cup of water is exactly the same as a loaf of bread without the flour. This will tell you exactly what your dough temperature will be in each of those 4 locations. You can do more than 4 if you want to. So here's what happened in my case. I did the coffee cup test. My thermostat is set to 37 degrees Fahrenheit. The top left rear of my refrigerator, my cooling unit is actually on top of my refrigerator. That back left corner is 35 degrees Fahrenheit or 1.7 degrees Celsius. That's actually colder than my thermostat setting. The top right front is 39 degrees Fahrenheit, 3.9 degrees Celsius. The middle center shelf, 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 2.2 degrees Celsius. And my bottom drawer on the right, 42 degrees Fahrenheit or 5.5 degrees Celsius. Look at that difference between the bottom right and the upper left. That's a 7-degree Fahrenheit difference. That's unbelievable, and that would have a massive impact on your loaf over a 72-hour period. So it's important to know what these different temperature points are in your refrigerator. Then once you know those, we can use these to our advantage. So if my 24-hour loaf is perfect, and that's on my middle shelf in my case, but my 8-hour loaf is underproofing a little bit, then I want to put the 8-hour loaf in the warmest spot in my refrigerator. So that would go in my bottom right drawer at that 42 degree Fahrenheit, 5.5 degrees Celsius temperature. That will help accelerate the proofing on that short timeline loaf. On the opposite end of the spectrum, my 72-hour loaf, I want that in my upper shelf in the back, that coldest spot in my refrigerator, because that's going to get the dough temperature down and really slow things down and give me a better proofing environment for a 72-hour loaf. You only have to do this test one time, and once you figure this out, it works. It's unbelievable how you can dial in that final proofing in the refrigerator over a long period of time with small changes in the temperature. 2 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius adds up over a 72-hour period. So this method gives you unbelievable flexibility in your scheduling. So if you know you need to bake a loaf on Saturday morning, but you have a busy week, you could prepare this dough Wednesday night, Thursday night, any of those times, and then based on what day you prepare it, you put it in a different spot in your fridge. It'll be perfectly proofed on Saturday morning when you bake it. So now let's put it all together. So let's go back to the fermentation model. And what you see here is now you understand you have control over all these variables, and these are the only variables you need to worry about. So now you know how to control these. So I recommend that you use a tracking sheet. Here's an example. And each time you bake, keep track of these 6 variables. That's all there are, 6 things that control the outcome. So here's an example of how you can now use this model to have total control over your timeline because you understand how the fermentation process works. Example number 1, 10% starter, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius. That bulks ferment for 14 hours. We get a 75% rise. We final proof for 24 hours. Our fridge temp is 39 degrees Fahrenheit. We assess the crumb. It's slightly underproofed. If my dough is underproofed, there's only one way to fix that: increase the percent rise. So now I do that, the same variables again, but I now go up to 85% rise. That works. We have a winner. Except I'm at 15 hours. So now 15 hours is too long for my window. So the way that I reduce bulk fermentation time, on the next row, I increase my starter percentage. So I go from 10% up to 15%. Now I get that 15 hours down to 12 hours. I have a good 12-hour loaf here. This is a 24-hour final proof loaf. Now I'm going to push that up to 48 hours on the next example. Comes out perfect again. Now I'm going to push my luck and go up to 72 hours in the fridge on the next example. This one is slightly overproofed. So my refrigerator is too warm for a 3-day final proof. So what do? I find that cold spot in my refrigerator. Now if I want to do a 3-day loaf, I move it to the cold spot. Run that test again. All the variables the same, except I'm at 37 degree Fahrenheit shelf on my fridge. That comes out perfect. I'm good to go. Now I have the formula for a 3-day loaf. I know where to put that in my refrigerator. Next, my work schedule changes and I can't do a 12-hour bulk fermentation anymore. Now I need to get it down to 10 hours. I have control because I can change my starter quantity. I bump it up from 15% to 20%. That reduces my bulk fermentation time to 10 hours. Now I have a 10-hour example that works. This will work every time. Next, it gets later in November. We start burning our fireplace. My kitchen's too warm at night. I can't control my overnight temperature. It goes up to 74 degrees. In the 10-hour window, my dough rises 110%. I overshoot the target. I overproof my loaf. Now I need to fix that. What can I do if my loaf's overproofing? I can reduce my starter percentage, and I can reduce my temperature a little bit by using that ice pack method that I talked about. So I use 15% starter. I get my overnight dough temperature down 2 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm still within the 10-hour window. I hit my 85% rise exactly. I get a spectacular loaf. So that's how the process works. You have control over the process. I just showed in 9 examples here the vast majority of the types of issues that you're going to run into. And once you figure out a solution for these, each one of these rows with the star on it, that's repeatable the next time. If you repeat those variables, you'll get the exact same result. It doesn't change. So once you've figured out a half dozen scenarios, slightly different temperatures, slightly different times, different final proofing times, you never go back and change those. They just work. Thank you for sticking with this video. I know it's been a long one. Now this is the culmination of almost 2 years of work that I've been doing, research, analysis, experiments, and I jammed everything in one place. I mean, it's a lot of information, but I wanted to have it all in one place for you so that you can start at the beginning, you can work on it in small steps. I don't expect that you're going to digest all this in one pass, but work on it for a month, come back, study another chapter, work on that for a month, come back, learn another technique. Within a few months' time period, these techniques will become second nature to you, and the whole goal of this was to get sourdough baking back into busy people's lives. If you follow this method and you master these techniques, I'm telling you, it works. You can decide on a Wednesday night after dinner, hey, I think I'll make sourdough tonight. You go into the kitchen for 30 minutes. You're done. Your kitchen's completely clean. The next day, before you go to work, you spend a few minutes shaping your dough. You put it into the refrigerator. Friday night, you're having a spaghetti dinner, and you say, hey, I'm going to make sourdough. You have a loaf in the fridge. It's ready to go. You make a fantastic loaf. You impress your friends. Your family loves it, and you're back in the sourdough game. That's really my goal. If you can do that, that'll make me happy. Thanks again for sticking with this video. I appreciate it, and good luck on your sourdough journey.